Garside here, and welcome to the second of a three-webinar series hosted by Asset Dynamics and ProjectMax. The webinar series is entitled Asset Management Done Well and is intended to be informative. It will allow water service asset management staff to think about planning improvement activities at the same time as considering the current and near-term legislative and organisational changes. As we all know, reform will put more pressure on prioritising investment decisions, and the webinar series addresses three of the core areas to act on now, during and before reform. The topic of the first webinar was levels of service and how they should be aligned to decision making with what matters to stakeholders. And today's topics will be to talk about asset management frameworks, using cars as an analogy, and as you'll see. The third webinar will examine how asset data can be used to inform decisions within the asset management framework, and this will be held after our national conference, which occurs in September, but the next webinar will be in October. Today's webinar will feature Rob Blakemore and Andrew Gatland. Rob is a well-known figure within the water industry with several years of experience in all aspects of the water industry, from being an asset manager to being a consultant and leading the training of industry professionals. Rob is a former president of Water New Zealand and the winner of numerous awards and an honorary life member of Water New Zealand. Andrew is a principal consultant at Asset Dynamics and has over 15 years experience leading asset management improvement in some of New Zealand's largest infrastructure organisations, including energy, utilities, transport and logistics. Andrew has extensive experience in applying ISO 55001, international standard for asset management, and led New Zealand's first certification to this standard in 2018. Andrew is immediate past chair of the New Zealand chapter of Asset Management Council and is a certified asset management assessor. Just a word on housekeeping. The webinar will be about 30 minutes long. Rob will go first, Andrew second, and that will be followed by a Q&A session. If you do have any questions, then please type them in the chat area and they will be answered during the Q&A session. After the webinar, you will be sent a recording of the webinar and also invites to the next webinar in the webinar series. So Rob, without further ado, over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. As Ian explained, I'm going to kick off, and I'm going to just describe what an asset management framework is and why it's so important in today's environment, particularly in this environment for the water industry. For a bit of information, when I talk about framework, a lot of you will have heard of the phrase asset management system. We are deliberately avoiding the use of that phrase. It's too often confused with an information system, which, as you would appreciate, is only really one part, but a very important part of an asset management framework. So I like to think of an asset management framework as a vehicle that's going to get you from where you are now to where you want to be. In doing this, the previous webinar, we talked about levels of service. And when you think about it, those levels of service really describe your destination, and the performance measures describe the way you are traveling to get to that destination as you do the journey. And so a vehicle is a very good way of thinking about it. So if we take this analogy a bit further, you really have to start when you build a car or of any vehicle with a good chassis. And once you've got that chassis, which is the foundation for adding things to it, you can start to get consistent decision making in a very cohesive way. So ISO 55000 helps in this way to starting with the chassis and starting to identify those components. And once you've got that chassis, and a good example of if you like, the basis of a chassis on the diagram on the left, which we talked about last webinar, you then start to identify the components. And these are of course, without all of these components, you won't have a vehicle to get you there. And so I've listed a few on the left-hand side: data standards, information systems, design standards, business processes, maintenance standards. I won't go through the list, but they're all components that need to be done to build on the frame, on the chassis, to get your vehicle working. And this is where IIM helps you here. You can get good guidance there in some situations, particularly with case studies. But the reality is, without all of these components, this vehicle won't work. But of course, to get you there, it takes time, and there's no point in worrying about having the most advanced vehicle when you're starting from scratch. And it doesn't matter, because what you need to do is establish the basic needs of those components, and then gradually with time develop those components until they are more mature, until they're serving your needs. But the first thing is that they have to be appropriate to your needs. So there's no point in having a supercar if you want a Ford Escort. And the other thing about it is, once you've identified where you need to have more maturity developed, have a program of improvement to get you there. So in summary, what is a framework? Well, you need a good chassis. You need to be able to identify all the components. You don't have to worry if they're basic to start with. You can always modify this vehicle. And what you modify will impact, of course, the speed that you achieve your levels of service. So it's very important to identify where you need to get better and what levels of service need addressing more importantly than others. So why do we need this framework now? What's important, particularly at this time? Well, in the water industry, from bitter experience and knowledge around the country, we're in an environment where we've got constrained funding and historic underfunding. We've got investment needs that exceed the money available. We need to prioritize, and also means that those levels of service have got risks because we're not spending the money on addressing those levels of service. We've got regulation that's increasingly require more evidence of performance. We do have uncertainty about the end of life of our assets. We've got growing populations and changing needs from customers, and of course, seemingly more growth of natural hazard challenges, including climate change. And on top of this, a shortage of skills. That's the environment we are in, whether we like it or not, in the water industry. But what are we going into? Well, we're going into an environment where we have to justify our charges and prices with evidence. We will need to have better knowledge of network performance and spending efficiency. We need to think of one water, not three, and I'm quite willing to have that debate, but you can't innovate by thinking separate waters. You will, in a new integrated environment, effectively be addressing competition from your neighbours for the same three waters dollar if you're becoming part of a larger organisation. And you're going to have multiple regulators and multiple reporting requirements where they're all going to ask you to make sure that you understand your risks and that you're managing those risks. You've got the key decisions are supported and owned, and you're making those decisions across the organisation awareness. And you're going to have external scrutiny and audits to make sure that this all happens. On top of that, you will be riding this renewals bow wave. So asset management frameworks, they need integration. An organisation needs to think cohesively. And of course, a very good video, unless I know some of you here will have watched this video, but it describes the classic organisation and why you need to integrate asset management thinking across the whole organisation, not just leave it to a department or a particular part of the organisation. So I do encourage you to have a watch of that video if you ever get the chance. And once we've got there and we've made this decision, we get some benefits. All teams understand the framework and how their role fits in. That's the important thing, because you don't have multiple people trying to do different things. You have aligned teams and priorities are linked to the levels of service. You know your assets. You're making decisions that are based on defined criteria that align with the requirements of the organisation, the regulators and stakeholders. Your plans, asset management plans, contain a credible forward view of work, which is where the risks are prioritised and so is the investment. You've got life cycle processes delivered consistently by team members who have the right competencies and resources, so you're addressing your skills. And you've got ownership at the top and encouragement at the top to get cohesive and consistent decision making. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Andrew, and he's going to discuss how to establish the framework.
Great, thanks, Rob. Good afternoon, all. Yeah, as Rob said, I'm going to talk about the process that an organization can take to establish an asset management framework. Now, establishing and embedding the asset management framework has significant benefits, as Rob's described. However, achieving this is often something organizations really struggle with. And a key reason that we see time and again is that the asset management theory that's embedded in the diagram to the right and the one that Rob referred to earlier, the theory is not really put into practice. Documents like ISO 55001 and the IIMM outline the requirements and components of the framework, the theory, but it's really leadership to involve people across the business to change the organization and make it real is where the rubber hits the road. So the role of leadership at the highest level of the organization in implementing the asset management framework really can't be overstated. If we think about the organization, the senior executive are there and accountable to implement the policies and strategies that are approved by the board or the governance function. And the asset management framework enables the implementation of the asset management policy and the strategic asset management plan. And so it follows that ensuring that the asset management framework is in place and effective is really the day job of the senior executive who's accountable for asset management. And that's something that often comes up in our work, where the historic approach to asset management has been a lot more reactive. It's been dealt with in a reasonably ad hoc way, and a key means of getting the business aligned and organized in a way to deliver asset management effectively is the senior leaders taking accountability for achieving that. And that's aligned with the ISO 55001 standard, which states that top management needs to demonstrate leadership and commitment by ensuring the integration of the asset management system requirements into the organization's business processes. So a key perspective that needs to be maintained through all of this, and it sort of relates back to the analogy that Rob raised with a vehicle, is that the asset management framework itself is an asset. And this is consistent with how ISO 55000 defines an asset, and it prompts us to think about a life cycle approach to the asset management framework. So if we think about that in context, some of the questions we might be asking of our framework is, firstly, is the specification and design of the framework appropriate to deliver the levels of service that we've set for ourselves? Has the asset management framework been implemented with appropriate engagement and communication across the organization? Thirdly, are we operating in conformance with the asset management framework and maintaining its elements? So when things change, when processes change in response to issues or opportunities, are we reflecting those process changes back into the framework and back into how the organization understands that framework? And finally, we may be monitoring the performance of the assets, but are we also monitoring the performance and continually improving the asset management framework? These are really key questions to consider in your own organizational context. So let's now turn to where the asset management framework fits into the organization and the inputs that we need to form it. So this diagram that I've got up here really takes two aspects of the document hierarchy or the asset management elements and separates. On the left-hand side, we have the hierarchy of the organizational strategic plan, the strategic asset management plan within the asset management system or asset management framework, then our tactical plans for our asset management plan, other plans for improving the organization, and down to our project and maintenance plans. On the right-hand side, we've got the documents that deal with the sort of the norms of the organization, how teams work together. So at the highest level, we have our operating model, which is all the different departments, finance, through to asset management, operations, and so on. And the sort of the management systems that those teams have in place, and hopefully in an integrated fashion. Within the asset management sphere, we have the asset management framework. And then beneath that, we have the asset management processes. And for those standard and repeatable tasks, we have procedures and work instructions. Now, when we're thinking about forming the asset management framework, of course, we need to ensure that we've got top-down alignment with the operating model and the integrated management system of the organization. We also need to ensure that the framework mops up the existing processes of the organization in a coherent way. So that, there will be a number of processes that are fit for purpose. Some of them may need to have some adjustment to align with levels of service. But we need to make sure that, they're consolidated into a coherent framework. Thirdly, we may get guidance from some of these authoritative documents, IIM, ISO 55000, Asset Management Landscape. Those documents are very helpful for us to draw on a generic understanding of modern asset management and reflect it in our own context. And then finally, we've got our strategic asset management plan and the plans that might be initiating. And those become drivers of change that are induced on the framework. So, for example, if we have a situation where we've deemed our criticality framework not fit for purpose, the SAMP may have one of the action items to improve or enhance that criticality framework, and that criticality framework becomes a key element of the asset management framework and needs to be reflected in that. So these are sort of the key drivers for when we're coming to form our asset management framework. And now we're going to turn to sort of practically how we do it. So if we have effective leadership, we understand the importance of change management. We've got those inputs that we've discussed in the previous slide. We need to bring that together into a practical process that we can deliver. So the starting point is we need to understand the scope of asset management. So in that previous slide, it was that sort of dotted box within which we have basically defined the scope of the asset management system, the asset portfolio, the process interfaces with other parts of the organization. And that scope statement needs to be drafted, needs to be consulted on with stakeholders, and that will be people within the asset management functions and other parts of the organization, such as finance, HR, and so on, so we can validate that. Next, we need to prepare an overview of the asset management framework. And this, in our language, this is a concise visual communication document that provides a precise specification of the framework, its elements, and how they interrelate. So typically, it's a diagram that highlights those different components of the vehicle that Rob referred to earlier and how they relate in the context of the organization. Forming this piece of work is really requires people who have deep knowledge of the organization, as well as people who understand the sort of modern concepts in asset management, highlighted in some of those documents I referred to earlier. And once this framework overview has been put together, it needs to be socialized and consulted on with stakeholders. And this process has two sort of benefits to it. The first is that you're getting feedback, and that will ultimately need to adjust the framework to make it more consistent with how people understand the organization. But the second benefit is that by communicating and socializing it, you're actually deepening people's understanding of asset management and the various topics that sit within it. Once that top level framework has been consulted on and stakeholders are broadly happy with its direction, then more detailed specification can be developed. So in the first instance, this might take the form of a manual that describes and defines how each of the elements in the overview document are implemented by the organization, including their interrelationships. And after this document has been communicated and updated based on feedback, we've really done the top-down part of the forming of the framework. And so it's been a reasonably engagement-heavy consultative process. So now we need to get into the sort of the bottom-up piece to embed the framework, and this is where the leadership piece is especially critical. So through the top-down work, there's inevitably been a range of opportunities identified to improve how the organization does things. The next piece is around these capability development projects, which are really bottom-up business improvement projects run by asset management teams to secure these opportunities. And this might include things like enhancement to the asset criticality framework, establishment of asset information plans, improvements to job scoping processes and job planning, and so on. And the really key thing is that each project has to be accountable to deliver, on the one hand, business improvement. So we want to obviously shift the dial on each of those areas that we identified are opportunities to improve the organization. But also we want to develop documentation that further defines the asset management framework. So we're linking in those bottom-up projects back into the top-down framework. And so in this way, as we go forward, we're successively delivering these projects, we're improving the business, we're also locking the change into the organization through good quality documentation that supports performance monitoring, it supports internal audit and continual improvement. And so we have this sort of top-down process linked to a bottom-up business improvement process. And this diagram, I've sort of presented these steps in series. However, in practice, if there is good leadership and there is good coordination in place between the top-down work and the bottom-up work, this can be delivered in parallel. And this can be a pretty valuable process because it can avoid the perception that the work is sort of just theoretical and it's not changing actually how asset management is being delivered on the ground. So in terms of key takeaways from this presentation, Rob's sort of mentioned that the asset management framework, what it is it's simply how we do asset management. And all organizations do have an asset management framework. What varies is how well it's designed, implemented, and controlled. And as we move into this changing environment where the quality and the performance of asset management is going to become under more scrutiny, and the importance of these stakeholder outcomes that Rob's referred to means that we can't really leave it to chance. A more structured and systematic approach is going to be needed. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the embedding the asset management framework is really where the rubber hits the road. We can do a lot of documentation and a lot of song and dance about the theory of asset management, but the reality is the framework needs to be embedded, and that's a leadership process and it's a change management process, and it has to involve people, it has to be consultative, it has to be participatory to be successful. And then finally, the asset management framework needs to be regarded as an asset of the organization and managed as such. So if we can apply sort of those life cycle management principles to the asset management framework itself, we're much more likely to get a better outcome. And some of those questions that I spoke of earlier may be relevant to take back to your teams. And finally, we've got a few questions to take back to your teams as well. So first of all, are you in situation A? Was your asset management framework invested in and operated once upon a time, but now lies forgotten and abandoned? B, is your asset management framework on the drawing board, a twinkle in the eye of a few, but not yet influencing how teams work? And then finally, C, is your asset management framework in use every day, adding value to your organization and helping teams work together? So I'll hand back now to Ian for some closing thoughts and to facilitate the Q&A session.
Thanks, guys. That was really interesting. And of course, all this can be really overwhelming, and having another pair of eyes available can help with this. So if you want another pair of eyes to look at your issues, please book a time with Rob or Andrew by clicking the QR code on the screen now. So I don't see any questions in the chat room, but if we now open the questions up, there's one there from Mr. Miller, I think. Mr. Miller, he says, what tools do you recommend to have asset management and risk investigation being elevated from an operational to form part of a tactical plan? I think that might be an Andrew question, or it might be Rob if you want to pick that one up.
I'm just questioning what he means by tactical plan. For me, I think the message we're saying is where you are suffering in an organisation, where your levels of service are suffering, that's where you need the most advanced tools. And so give that focus. I don't know whether that helps, but if you want to come online and speak, I don't know if we can do that. then it would be interesting to get a bit more elaboration. But my point about risk assessment, it depends on where these risks are in the organisation before to know whether you're going to give this emphasis to, if you like, lift the maturity or the advancement of that vehicle or the components of that vehicle in any one space. So if you've got a problem with water safety, for example, then that's when your risk assessment tools need to be advanced. Or if you've got a problem with renewals and a lack of maintenance money, that's when you'll need to have good maintenance procedures and renewals prioritizations and criticality frameworks. Is that a sensible answer?
Chris,
maybe I can have a stab at it as well. I think maybe some people have had a look at the latest version of the ISO 55001 standards released in July. They've got a new clause 4.5, which deals with asset management decision making. And that's quite an interesting clause, and it basically defines 3 things that an organization needs to do to drive decision making, which obviously it becomes the input to planning. The first is there needs to be a decision making framework, and what they mean by that is, I believe, is the organization needs to identify what are the different decisions that need to be made. So one of those is going to be around forming those tactical plans, those asset investment plans. The second one is the decision-making criteria. So what are the mandatory considerations that have to be taken into account when making those decisions? And then thirdly, the decision-making methods and tools, which I think is what you're referring to. So I think where the ISO standards are coming from is they're saying decision-making needs to start at the strategic level, and then it needs to be decomposed into those criteria, and then how we're actually going to use tools, methods, and we need to define all of that. And that all obviously forms a key part of the asset management framework.
Thank you, guys. Got another question. This is a good one, actually, as was that one. But how do you ensure alignment with other parts of the business and the AMS, which I presume means asset management framework, e.g., finance and HR? What drives this and prevents silos?
I would argue, and Andrew, you chip in after me. I would argue this is about leadership and communication, and so there is no point in all doing separate things in separate ways. It's like going on a journey and you're finding you're going down different streets. The whole idea of this, and I think in Andrew and your stages, was to get the right scope and get the right leadership in creating this framework to start with, and getting buy-in for that. And there are many examples of the lack of coordination, which drives asset failures, which drives pleas for more investment, and this is where the single determination that my department's better than somebody else's inhibits an asset management system or an asset management framework being well implemented.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The leadership piece is key. If you've got a motivated and somebody who's really taken ownership of the asset management system at the executive level, then they'll be motivating this along with their peers, who are looking after the other major functional areas of the organization. The process that I described around establishing the asset management framework, that process needs to involve wider stakeholders than just people within the traditional asset management function. That needs to really touch all of those processes where there are interfaces with asset management. So, if we're thinking about HR, a key area is obviously competency management. If the HR team are providing a competency framework for the organization, then the asset management people need to be able to tap into that in order to define the competencies that we require with regard to asset management. From the finance side, obviously that's a piece where we've got the interactions between the asset management planning process that are identifying risks in the assets and needs for investment. Those needs for investment need to be discussed with finance, and there needs to be a really clear process interface about how finance stakeholders are brought into the asset management planning process early, instead of towards the end, once all the sort of the technical decisions have been made, and then only then finance get involved. So I think by defining those processes well, you can identify where those process interface points are, and ensure that those stakeholders get consulted with.
Okay,
There's one
thank
other
you.
point here that I'd like to add around HR. Competency frameworks should not be underestimated. So when you're talking about competency across the organisation, you're not just talking about different areas of competency. You're talking about the competencies needed to adequately manage the assets of the organisation, and that includes operational skills, asset management skills, all these other skills. And so consistent competency frameworks and an idea of where people sit on those frameworks needs addressing. So and where they need to be at certain levels, how advanced they need to be. This is an area that I've had passionate involved with all my life, and I wish I could talk more about it. But if someone wants to book some time, we'll have a chat. That'd be great. But it's something that's particularly important.
Yeah, it's very good. There was a lot of claps when you were talking there, Rob, and a lot of thumbs up, which it's obviously you know, makes some sense and resonates well with the people on the call. Got another question, and I'm gonna add to this question because I was thinking the same thing as Joe was thinking. He's saying that he or she is saying we have documents drafted, but they're sitting on the shelf collecting dust. How can change management drive this into day-to-day practice? And the bit that I would add is around the proposed coalition of organisations under water reform. A number of organisations will have documents drafted and sitting on shelves. How do we bring it all together? How do we manage that change?
I've got one thought on this. I've just had some recent involvement with the South Island Council where they are trying to set up an environmental management framework, and also, of course, better knowledge with water safety planning. It's around governance, and so you've got to have the right buy-in. I'm not talking about at councillor level or at senior leadership level. You've got to have enough situations where you're regularly asking how are your risks being managed, and how well is your framework and what you've got documented being used to do that. And the only way you can do that is to regularly ask those questions, and that becomes your constant improvement. So I'm particularly aware that this question is going to be asked by Tamata Arawa. How well are you? How do we know you're implementing your water safety plan? But it's not sitting on a shelf. What are you doing about it? And the only way you can do that is to force people to own it and force people to systematically go through and address those risks, the controls, and the components of the framework that are being used to mitigate those controls.
Andrew, anything to add?
Yeah, I think governance is really important. I mean, the question is, I guess, if it's sitting on the shelf, not adding any value, then is the document really required? I mean, the documents exist to manage risk. If we've got processes in place that aren't managing any risks, then are they really necessary? That would be a perspective to consider. The other angle to it is looking at it from the perspective of the asset management framework or the asset management system as a whole. Are we regularly reviewing the performance of the asset management system as a whole? That's going to be conducted through sort of performance evaluation type processes. The other one would be internal audit. So if we've defined all these processes, are we actually examining to the extent to which they're being implemented and being used and are effective? And finally, the management review piece. Is the top management across all of these processes, are they regularly meeting to evaluate whether they're being implemented correctly and identifying opportunities to improve?
I think the other thing, just adding to this, being left on the shelf, if leaving them on a shelf because you have to write these documents is an approach for an organisation, it won't be acceptable really as we move into a new era of economic regulation supported by water quality regulation, environmental regulation. You would need to be progressively seeing how you are addressing your needs, and it won't be good enough to lurch from every 3 year to 3 year to say, here's my financial plan, without having been seen to use your asset management approaches to derive that plan progressively over the previous 3 years.
Okay.
Or 5 years or whatever it is.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Andrew. There's a bit, there's not really questions, but people are referring in the chat to risk profile, examination of risk to drive this process, and so on and so forth. So that's just a statement rather than anything else. And I think the people that have raised that are bang on. We've got a question which would be, I would be interested to hear what IT systems people are using for asset management. And this wasn't about systems, but the knowledgeable people on the call may have be able to offer an answer to that. Rob,
I think you'll probably find there's a plethora of them. We all know in the water industry what information system was going to be promoted under a form. I think when you come to webinar 3, this is going to be more relevant, because when we discuss data, well, the first thing you'll need to do is identify your data needs and why you've got data needs, rather than just putting up the system that's going to give you your data that you have to use. So I think maybe we park that one for the time being, or if anyone wants to chip in. But there's a plethora of information systems being out there from across the industry. You name it, they've got it at the moment.
I think a comment on that point. There's often what stimulates change with regard to asset management organizations is someone gets the idea that everything that's holding us back is we don't have the right information system. And so, the focus of the organization becomes procurement of an IT solution rather than improving an asset management. Now, I've seen this in many organizations, and my strong advice is define the asset management framework first. The asset management framework you can think of as the requirements for the information system. So if we have the asset management framework well defined, we have the information requirements that those processes utilize, then we can make a good decision about an EAMS or an asset management CMMS or what have you. Certainly jumping into buying an IT solution to fix asset management is doesn't meet with success.
It's only one component of an asset management framework.
Yeah.
And theoretically, you can do it with a bunch of cards.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of comments, and there's a bit of chat in the chat around various IT systems, Asset Finder, Unity, RAM are all mentioned, and perhaps we'll pick that up in the third webinar. But Dave says that I think his view is, and he might want to respond to this, but I think he's suggesting that the system holds the framework together. It's a different view of the world. But David, do you want to elaborate on that for me? And GIS can do an awful lot, says David. Okay, well, look, if there's, are there any further questions from David or anyone else for that matter?
Oh, someone's locked out. He can't speak. Is that?
One moment.
We can enable microphones.
Yeah, I'll see if we can. See how that goes.
David, I think you can now speak.
No.
No.
Okay, no, you can't. Sorry about that, Dave. But if you want to drop us a line or book a time to meet either Rob or Andrew to raise this issue. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, team. Excellent. I'm glad you enjoyed the webinar. Water New Zealand. Right. Okay. And yes, lots and lots of claps, thumbs up, and love hearts. The love hearts will be at you, Andrew, of course, and maybe even Rob. Just a reminder that the third in the webinar series, which is going to be on data, as we've mentioned, that's due to be held. Andrew, just remind me the date of that, if you can remember.
2nd of October.
2nd of October. So that's going to be the week after our Water New Zealand conference. And we will look forward to meeting all of the water industry at our conference in Kirikiriroa, Hamilton, at Claudelands Event Centre once again. And if you're really lucky, you can come and hear me talk about something I'm passionate about, which is wastewater overflows. Look forward to you all meeting you in Hamilton, and have a great week.